Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. I am Yaisa Wahab Adil, one of your reporters for this day. And now, I am here to talk about the sum of authorities in education and their contribution. Wilhelm Wundt, a German physiologist, and he is known as one of the founding figures of modern psychology. The book Physiological Psychology is still used today, but did not refer to the study of psychological basis of psychology but to psychology using experimental techniques. Wilhelm Wundt's support of experimental psychology also said states of behaviorism of many of his experimental methods are still used today. Today, structuralism is less popular than approaches such as post-structuralism and deconstruction. By the end of the century, structuralism was seen as a historically important school of thought, but it was the movement of spawn rather than the structuralism itself, which commanded attention. Introspection is the examination of one's unconscious thoughts and feelings was the first to adapt introspection to experimental psychology. Introspection is still widely used in psychology but under different names such as self-report surveys, interviews, and fMRIs. However, these critics forget the second observational tool that Wundt's research was based on: reaction time, or how long it takes to react to stimuli. Reaction time is still widely used today and is an important tool in understanding the complexity of mental processes. Jean Piaget, a Swiss psychologist, and he is known for his epistemological studies for children. In Piaget's theory, obvious that we have to conquer the four stages of cognitive development. First, the sensory motor stage. Second, the pre-operational stage. Third, the concrete operational stage. Fourth, the formal operational stage. Only once we have gone through all the stages, and one day each can vary, we are able to reach full human intelligence. One, the sensory motor stage, ages birth to 2. In the sensory motor stage, we develop experiences of the movement of our five senses. Our brain wants to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch as much as possible. First, we start in simple reflexes, and soon after we develop our first habits. From 4 months old, we become aware of things beyond around our body, and then, when we get older, we learn to do things intentionally. A key milestone is the development of working memory, or in Piaget's term, our realization of object. Before that, our mom can show and then hide the teddy and we will think it's gone. After, we understand the object is continue to exist, even we can see them. We stop becoming curious about everything. We want to smell flowers, taste the food, listen to sounds, and talk to strangers. To explore more, we move, we learn to sit, crawl, stand, walk, and even to run. This increased physical mobility consequently need to increase cognitive development, and we will remain egocentric, meaning we can perceive the world only in our own point of view. 2. The pre-operational stage, ages 2 to 7. Our thinking is mainly categorized or symbolic function. We have a lot of fantasies and beliefs objects to our lives, as we are not able to apply specific cognitive operations. Piaget calls this stage pre-operational. We learn to speak and understand words, images, gesture, and symbol of something else. When we draw our family, we are not concerned about drawing each person to scale, but rather with symbolic meanings. We love to play pretend. At around age of 4, most of us become very curious and ask many questions. We want to know everything. We can call it a primitive reasoning. Our thinking in this stage is still pretty egocentric. We think others see the world like we do, and still don't understand that they see it differently. 3. The concrete operational stage, age 7 to 11. In logic, we develop concrete cognitive operations, such as sorting objects in a certain order. One example of this is inductive reasoning, which means if we see someone eating a cookie, we can draw a conclusion and then make a generalization, and we now get a concept of conservation. We understand that if we pour orange juice from normal glass to a taller one, the amount is still the same. Our younger sister will pick the taller glass that she thinks she gets more, but the same logic. We only now understand that 3 plus 5 equals 8 and 8 minus 3 must be equal to 5. 4. The formal operational stage, ages 12 plus. Once we become teenagers, we become formally operational. We now have the ability to think more rationally about abstract concepts. Our advanced cognitive abilities allow us to understand abstract concepts, such as excitation failure, love and hate. We form a deeper understanding about wrong identity and our morality. We now also think that we understand why people behave the way they behave, and as a result, we become more compassionate. Ivan Pavlov, a Russian psychologist, and he is known for his work classical conditioning. Pavlov became a well-known psychologist after his work with dogs and studying digestion. He developed a theory called classical or Pavlovian conditioning. Ivan Pavlov conducted neurophysiological experiments with animals for years. After receiving his doctorate at the Academy of Medical Surgery, he became fully convinced that human behavior could be understood and explained best in physiological terms rather than in mentalist terms. The legendary experiment for which Pavlov is remembered was when he used the feeding of dogs to establish a number of his key ideas. Classical or Pavlovian conditioning. Classical conditioning is a type of learning that had a major influence on the school of thought in psychology known as behaviorism, discovered by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. Classical conditioning is a learning process that occurs through association between an environmental stimulus and naturally occurring stimulus. Behaviorism is based on the assumption that learning occurs through interaction with the environment. Two other assumptions of this theory are that the environmental shapes behavior and taking internal mental state, such as thoughts, feelings, and emotions, into consideration is useless in explaining behavior. It's important to note that classical conditioning involves placing a neutral signal before a naturally occurring reflex. In Pavlov's classical experiment with dogs, the neutral signal was the sound of a tone and the naturally occurring reflex was salivating in response to food. By associating the neutral stimulus with the environmental stimulus, the sound of the tone alone could produce the salivation response. In order to understand more about how classical conditioning works, it is important to be familiar with the basic principle of the process. Principle of classical conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus is one that unconditionally, naturally, and automatically triggers a response. For example, when you smell one of your favorite food, you may immediately feel very hungry. In this example, the smell of the food is the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response. The unconditioned response is the unlearned response that occurs naturally in response to the unconditioned stimulus. In our example, the feeling of hunger in response to the smell of food is the unconditioned response. For example, the sight or smell of food, this is the unconditioned stimulus, causes the dog to salivate, this is the unconditioned response. Ordinarily, a neutral stimulus, such as a bell ring, does not cause the dog to salivate. There is no response to food, only to a sound where the dog may move its ears. Alfred Bennett. He invented the first practical intelligence, the Bennett scale. Background and achievements. He married Laurie Balbiani and he carried out home experiments with his daughters and observed their behavior and responses in a systematic approach. He was a member of Free Society for the Psychological Study of the Child, and he also volunteered at the Laboratory of Experimental Psychology. Interesting facts about Alfred Bennett. He never formally attended university to study psychology, and he wrote more than 200 books, articles, and reviews. Contribution to psychology. Bennett is most known for the Simon Bennett scale, or the Stanford Bennett IQ test. The Simon Bennett scale, it is a cognitive and intelligence test that is used to diagnose developmental or intellectual deficiencies in children. The test measures 5 factors: knowledge, quantitative reasoning, visual spatial processing, working memory, and fluid reasoning. It includes verbal and non-verbal tests. The Stanford Bennett scale is a modified version of the Simon Bennett scale. Historical impact. The Simon Bennett scale is still used today, although slight changes have been made to it. Current uses for the test include clinical and neuropsychological assessment, educational placement, compensation evaluations, career assessment, adult neuropsychological treatment, forensic and research on aptitude. Various high IQ society also accepted tests for admission into the ranks. The SBS can be administered to individuals through 85 plus years of age. Edward Thorndike, he is famous on his development of operant conditioning under behaviorism. Thorndike's connectionism theory. The learning theory of Thorndike represents the original SR framework of behavioral psychology. Learning is the result of association forming between stimuli and responses. 3 laws of learning: law of readiness, law of exercise, and the last one is law of effect. Law of readiness. First primary law of learning, according to him, is the law of readiness or the law of action tendency, which means that learning takes place when an action tendency is aroused through preparatory adjustment, set or attitude. Readiness means a preparation of action. Law of exercise. The law of exercise had 2 parts, the law of use and the law of disuse. This law stated that connection grows stronger when used, where strength is defined as vigor and duration as well as the frequency of its making, and grow weaker when not used. Many examples of this case are found in case of human learning, learning to drive a motor car, typewriting, singing, or memorizing a poem or mathematical table. Need exercise and repetition of various movements and actions many times. Law of effect, which states that responses which occur just prior to a satisfying state of affair are more likely to be repeated, and responses just prior to an annoying state of affair are more likely not to be repeated. The second contribution was his rejection of the notion that man is simply another animal that can reason. He believed intelligence should be defined solely in terms of greater or lesser ability to form connections. James Cattell, a head of psychology at Columbia University. He also stressed the importance of quantification, ranking, and rating. He was also recognized as the father of mental testing, and he became the president of American Psychological Association. The life and work of psychologist James McKim Cattell. He was the first psychology professor in the United States, teaching at the University of Pennsylvania. During those early days, psychology was often regarded as a lesser science and was often viewed as a pseudoscience. He studied the new experimental psychology, both Wundt and Galton, before setting at Columbia University for 20 years. Cattell is credited with helping establish psychology's legitimacy as a science. Thanks to his focus on quantitative methods, he was also the founder and editor of a number of scientific journals, including the Psychological Review. Contribution to psychology. In the struggle for existence that obtains among the science psychology is continually gaining ground. The academic growth of psychology in America during the past few years is almost without precedent. Psychology is a required subject in the undergraduate curriculum and among university courses. Psychology now rivals the other leading sciences in the amount of students attracted and in the amount of original work accomplished. Cattell is an important figure in psychology, thanks to research and intelligence. His use of quantitative methods and his focus on establishing psychology as a legitimate science. Cattell was fundamental in establishing several major psychology journals, including the Psychological Review, Science, and Popular Science Monthly, which later went on to become Popular Science.